Okay, hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond, Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. Happy New Year to you all. As AGSI enters its 11th year in operation, we're grateful for your continued participation and support. And thank you especially for joining us today to kick off the year with this webinar looking at the new year and what it might bring for the Gulf and the U.S. Gulf relations. We are joined today by our President, Ambassador Douglas Silliman, our Executive Vice President, Ambassador Bill Roebuck, Senior Resident Scholars Hussein, Ibish, and Kristin Diwan, Senior and Visiting Fellows Ali Alfoneh and Tim Callen, and last but not least, the latest addition to our Brain Trust, Dr. Abbas Kadhim, who joined us late last year as a Senior Resident Scholar and the Director of our newly launched Iraq program. Welcome to you all. So Doug, let's start with you. 2025 saw high-profile visits between the U.S. and the Gulf and major announcements regarding trade and investment. How do you see U.S. Gulf relations shaping up in 2026, and what are the issues that will be top of mind for you?
Raymond, thank you very much. And to all our viewers, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and Happy New Year. Raymond, it's a really good question. And one of the things I will be watching most carefully is the developments in the relationship between the Trump administration and the governments of the Gulf, both the GCC and the other countries of the region. Now, it's clear that the very strong personal relationship that President Trump has with a number of Gulf leaders has led to massive commitments of investment in purchases and even defense cooperation. What I'm a little bit concerned about is that a weakened U.S. bureaucracy, particularly at the middle levels, is going to have trouble keeping up with the thousands of deals, the thousands of regulatory questions, and the thousands of hours that will have to be spent negotiating the details of all of the components of these pledges. Secondarily, I also want to look, though, at the relations among Gulf governments. While most Gulf governments have started development programs, sustainable energy programs, and a lot of tech and AI investment, they're mostly working on parallel strands. They're not coordinating much. And we've begun to see both economic and foreign policy tension and competition, particularly between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And it will be important for the leaders of the Gulf in the coming year to find a modus vivendi, a way to work through these tensions a bit, come to an understanding so they don't lose opportunities to cooperate on bigger regional threats like Iran, Islamic extremism, or the potential resurgence of conflict in the Levant or in Syria. So those will be the governmental relations that I'll be looking at most closely in the coming year.
Thank you, Doug. If I can follow up quickly on that, especially with recent developments, the U.S. operation that captured Maduro in Venezuela, Trump and President Trump and his administration's comments about Greenland. How do you think that shift in U.S. kind of approach to allies and non-allies globally affect relations with the Gulf, and especially when it comes to these internal tensions?
What I think, Raymond, first of all, I'm going to let a couple of our scholars address some of those questions in a little bit more detail going forward. I think that there are real opportunities for the Gulf in some of the things that the United States intends to do, including economic opportunities in Venezuela, potential economic opportunities in Greenland, whether the United States moves to take control of Greenland or not. But with that could become greater political tensions and putting the Gulf more in the realm of American allies implementing American policy, which is not necessarily going to be as easy a road to go down in the future. So I think over the course of the conversation, this is something we should tease out in a number of different areas. American policy could provide more opportunities for the Gulf, but I think it will also introduce some pitfalls and tensions that will also have to be worked through as we go forward.
Great, thank you. Hussein, let me shift to you. It's fair to say that 2025 was a dramatic year for the region. But without rehashing all the seismic events that took place, which events do you think will continue to reverberate this year, and how does the region look to you in general as we enter this new year?
Okay, so I think the two biggest changes at the strategic level that will impact Gulf foreign policies and national security calculations are, first of all, the changes in the balance of power brought about by, as a consequence of the October 7, 2023 Hamas-led attack on southern Israel and Israel's war in Gaza. That kicked off a series of events that reverberated. But the main game changer was actually not a consequence of anything Israel did directly. It was more a Turkish-led initiative to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And the reason this is such a game changer for Gulf calculations is that Iran has lost its access to the Western Mediterranean. You can imagine the whole northern Middle East almost like a book, and that can close on itself between the East and the West. And with the West being Iraq, Iran, Gulf countries, etc., and on the West, sorry, that's the eastern part, Iraq, Iran, and Gulf countries. On the western part, you have Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, etc. Where this is the sort of the hinge on which this Middle Eastern connectivity takes place or doesn't is the Iraq-Iran border. The Iraqi-Syrian border. Forgive me. And especially the crossing near the American garrison at Tanf. And Iran now has lost its access to Syria, so it can still continue to manipulate its so-called axis of resistance in Iraq and in Yemen. But it has lost direct access to Hezbollah, to Hamas even. Syria being closed to Iran is now renders Lebanon much further out of reach of the Iranians. And it's not going to be possible, I think, for Iran to come up with a solution that restores a friendly government in Damascus. This has reduced Iran's power and long-term prospects as a regional hegemon much more than the Israeli attacks on Iran itself, than the blows administered to Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis or anything like that. This is the long-term game changer. And what it means is Gulf countries have more freedom of movement when it comes to issues that would have paralyzed them before for fear of Iran. At the same time, you see the emergence of Israel as being perceived in the Gulf no longer as a net contributor to security and stability, despite dismay at Israel's treatment of Palestinians and sometimes Lebanese. When Israel was part of a coalition, an American-led coalition confronting Iran and its axis of resistance, that was sort of an invaluable asset. That's now no longer the case, both because Iran is so weakened and because Israel is emerging as a great source of instability and insecurity from Gulf perspectives, and especially if you look at their behavior in Syria, the land grabs, the revving up of the Druze issue, the open pursuit by Israel of a Syria that is fragmented, decentralized, weak, and divided. And that's what the Israelis say openly they want, although I think it's kind of a really silly goal, but that's what they say they want. So the other big change has to do with the way in which, hold on a second. The other great change has to do with the way in which all of this affects Gulf relations with the United States. So with Israel rising as a source of tensions, things like expanding the Abraham Accord become absolutely impossible. And in fact, it's going to be difficult if Israel moves towards more annexation in the West Bank to prevent harm being done from relations that are established. So what I'll be looking at is, how the reduction of Iran as a threat and the rise of Israel as a threat combine to reshape Gulf calculations and foreign policy national security.
Yeah. Thank you, Hussein. If I can just throw a quick follow-up
Sure.
about the role of Turkey, because events in
Yeah.
Syria did change or open up a door for further Turkish engagement. How do you see kind of Turkey's role? Is there room for cooperation with Gulf states there, or will this create more tension?
Well, Turkey has tread lightly in Syria. It has not attempted to impose its will in a dramatic way in Syria, which is maybe surprising, but it is wise. Um, I think you can see from the Saudi cooperation with Turkey in Syria, where they're each kind of respecting each other's, I wouldn't quite say spheres of influence in Syria, but just about. And certainly each other's role in reconstruction, rebuilding in Syria, and working together, along with Washington, to strengthen the regime led by the former Jolani, currently al-Shara, leader of Syria, leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who has become the president of Syria. And what's fascinating about that is that Saudi Arabia and Israel had a face-off in Washington over policy towards Syria. And like the Turks, the Saudis were arguing that the U.S. should drop sanctions, embrace Ashra, give him a chance, and work for a united, centralized, calm, functional Syria, and not approach the new Syrian government with the kind of caution and suspicion that Israel was advocating and that Israel itself has been pursuing. And it is maybe the first time in living memory, and possibly ever, that there was a policy argument and a narrative between Israel on the one hand and an Arab country on the other hand about U.S. foreign policy towards a third country. Syria in this case, that was won by the Arab side. I mean, clearly the Trump administration has been swayed by Riyadh's analysis of what's going on in Syria, and that's inflected by a tentative partnership with Ankara on stabilizing Syria, rebuilding there, and strengthening the government. The U.S. is participating in that. Israel is, to say the least, not participating in it, and I think you could say actively trying to thwart it. And it's just been fascinating to watch as 2025 unfolded, the extent to which the Israelis lost the argument to the Saudis in Washington over what U.S. policy towards Syria should be.
Thank you, Hussein. Kristin, if I can shift to you, we've been discussing kind of the region shifting geopolitically, but so have global trends as well in the past year. How have you observed the Gulf states keeping up and maintaining a role in global affairs?
Thanks, Raymond. I think what's been really stunning in the last several years is to realize, as all of us have been experiencing these major changes, both in geopolitics and in the global economy. I mean, we've basically been through a period where we're going through a very serious energy transition, which, is moving the world in significant ways away from oil and into other forms of energy. This is the very basis on which the whole world global economy runs. You may have thought that, of course, would be a direct challenge to the Gulf states and how are they going to maintain their relevance in this transition. And we see that they've really done incredibly well in staying extremely important. And in fact, as they've gone through this required energy transition, which has been, kind of forced upon them that they can't rely on oil as much anymore, we see that they've moved into all of these other kinds of fields and that they're actually having increased influence and that their influence is just as high as it was before. I mean, we can see that in AI and the other AI deals that were done in technology, where it looks like the Gulf is going to have kind of a role as being sort of a hub, using their still energy power to be extremely relevant in that new economy that's emerging. We can see it as they've moved into areas which they really weren't as relevant before, into even kind of softer areas like sports and culture, where they're really moving things. I mean, you can't talk about global sport right now without looking at the Gulf states and their investments and how they're impacting things. We've got a World Cup year coming up. We had one World Cup already in Qatar. We're going to have another World Cup in Saudi Arabia. That's just one example of the largest sport event in the world that the Gulf has inserted themselves in. And we spend a lot of time at the Institute as well looking at the arts field and culture fields. And the Gulf states, which weren't even seen as relevant in the Middle East at one point or in the Arab world have now become global players. We're going to have, we have the Sorbonne and in Abu Dhabi. We have Saudi Arabia running biennales now. And I think we're going to have the Guggenheim opening soon in another year, also in Abu Dhabi. So you can see these states are really affecting the things in those areas too. That's really striking to me. I mean, you may not have, thought that the diffusion of their power into these different areas has really resulted in them being relevant in these new fields. And I think geopolitically, we're seeing, of course, an equivalently large challenge. I think, as Ambassador Silliman was hinting at, we have an entire reorganization of the global order right now, away from a liberal democratic order to one that's looking more like power centers, where the US is centering much more on, its kind of area. In Latin America, we can see that now with Venezuela and even Greenland, that we're kind of pushing our own interests in those areas, with Russia and Ukraine. And also, we might talk about China and what they're doing with Thailand. These are really huge challenges. Again, can the Gulf remain relevant in this kind of world? These are countries that are based on the liberal order and economic order, being kind of hub states. And we've seen that they've been able to maintain their relevance there too, through mediation between the big powers, and through kind of, as Hussein mentioned, kind of filling into those gaps, when the challenges come to Iran, they're willing to step in and play a larger role in those countries where Iran has been pushed back. Same with the United States, they're willing to take more of a role. So I think another thing that I'll be looking at is also something that was hinted at by Ambassador Silliman, which is, as they start to play these much bigger roles, we're seeing their strategies globally become much more mature. You can really see now what they're trying to do. I mean, if you look at like what the UAE is doing in terms of its port strategy around the, Arabian Peninsula, moving into the Red Sea, that's a much more mature vision that we can see of what they're trying to do. And that's now coming into conflict amongst each other. We can see that today in Yemen, between Saudi Arabia and UAE. So I think understanding a bit more what their strategies are and how they're going to be managing those is definitely, as the ambassador said, something that we'll be watching very closely this year.
Great, thank you, Kristin. Bill, if I can bring you in here and just return to Hussein's comments on Syria. How do you see the country moving this year, and especially how will Gulf influence in Syria shape developments?
Thank you, Raymond. I believe that developments in Syria do help illustrate some of the broader Gulf dynamics that Doug referenced in his opening remarks, and Hussein also referenced more specifically regarding Syria. In terms of U.S. Gulf relations and relations with leadership, I think Gulf leaders have developed close relationships with President Trump. He listens to their advice, he respects their influence, and he sees them as useful collaborators, whether for investing in the United States economy or exercising regional influence and on security in particular. And in that context, and particularly regarding Syria, I think it's inconceivable what President Trump did in Syria. If you put aside the advice that he got from Gulf leaders, particularly from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman last spring, I think there was very little on its face for the Trump administration to like about the jihadi group that took power in Syria a little over a year ago. And yet President Trump met with Ashara in the spring. It was a move that shocked most observers, including insiders in his administration. And he has since moved decisively to receive Ashara at the White House in Washington and to lift sanctions on Syria, overriding longstanding opposition in Washington. President Trump has also built an ongoing U.S. diplomatic and military relationship with the Ashara government. And I think that relationship supports the fight against ISIS, and it has provided a degree of balance and correction to what Washington, I believe, has viewed as an overly muscular Israeli policy on Syria. And I think the U.S. approach in this regard seems to be bearing some fruit, with reports that Syria and Israel are developing a beginning of a security relationship. More broadly, I think Syria highlights a realigned Gulf, and Hussein talked about this a little bit in his remarks. Qatar is firmly reintegrated now. There's closer alignment with Turkey on trade and geopolitics, including in Syria. And there's a concerted push diplomatically and economically to reinforce Gulf and Arab influence in the Levant, taking advantage of the collapse of the Iranian presence and influence there. I do think that Syria also points to some broader Gulf, shall we say, disalignment, particularly with Saudi Emirati differences in approach in Syria. The Saudis in Syria have emphasized the importance of sovereignty, national unity, and national security. The Emiratis have supported the Shah government. They have received him, as the Saudis and the Qataris have done, and they have committed significant investment in Syria. For example, to modernize the port at Tartus, an $800 million investment commitment. But I would say overall, the Emiratis have placed relatively more stress in regional policy on the dangers posed by Islamist political power and other radical groups. So in the coming year, I'll be looking very closely at how Gulf policy has impact in Syria and how some of the broader dynamics that I have mentioned and others have referenced will play out in Syria and other parts of the periphery of the Gulf. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can bring in a question from the audience from Robert Rubin, asking more about kind of internal developments in Syria and a federalized system versus a partially independent ethnic related provinces, as he puts it. How do you see things moving this year and internally? Is there a tendency for more kind of an internal consolidation, or what is kind of the status of intra-Syrian dialogue?
I think the Syrian government is going to, the Ashar government is going to struggle with these issues. I think they have a commitment through a framework agreement to integrate Kurdish-led forces in the northeast into the broader national military forces. This is going to continue to be a huge struggle going forward. And I think there are energies in Syria that are pulling it away from a sort of a unified national government and closer towards federalist type energies, but I think they're going to be very difficult to maintain or control on the sort of constitutional dialogue, the national dialogue. I think there may be some efforts on these fronts, but I don't see them getting much traction in the coming year. I think the focus is going to be on internal security and efforts of the Shah government to get control of some of these energies I've talked about that are pulling against a national current in the country.
Right, thank you. Tim, if I can move on to you, and thank you for your patience, you and Ali and Abbas, as we make our way to you. Obviously, Venezuela and its vast oil reserves are the focus here in the early days of 2026, but we haven't seen the price of oil affected much. So kind of looking at this year, what do you think the impact of current prices of oil around $60 a barrel on Gulf economies, especially the Saudi economy, which you look at more closely?
Yeah, thanks, Raymond. And yeah, I mean, I think that what happens in the oil market is certainly one of the key issues for Saudi this year. I mean, my calculation is that the 2026 budget, which had a deficit of just over 3% of Saudi GDP, is based on an oil price in the low 70s. So if we're, in the low 60s as a, sustainable way, clearly that's going to put quite a hole in the budget. And, I think estimates, Goldman Sachs have a, estimate of the fiscal deficit of 6% of GDP this year based on their oil price assumptions. So I think, one question that I'll be looking at is, if oil does stay down at, low 60s, or even if it drops further, how's the government going to react to that? Is it going to be looking to borrow more to sustain its planned spending levels, or will it begin to pare back spending, or at least delay the spending? We've seen in the last week or so some pretty significant borrowing by the government. There was this syndicated loan of about 13 billion late last year. Just recently this week, 11.5 billion in bond issuance. So already there's substantial borrowing going on, and the question is, will that continue? I think beyond the immediate central government budget, it also calls questions: if oil stays around current levels, what does this mean, for the giga projects domestically? What does it mean for the investment commitments that have been made to the US? And indeed, what does it ultimately mean for, Saudi financing of reconstruction elsewhere in the region? So I think this whole oil price, government spending, government investment nexus is one thing to keep an eye on. I think the other thing that I'm going to be looking at this year is really in April we're going to reach the 10th anniversary of the Vision 2030 publication. Um, and I think it's fair to say, a huge amount has been achieved under Vision 2030. Certainly, as I sat looking at the Saudi economy, 10, 12 years ago, I would never have imagined the degree of change that has gone on both economically and socially in the kingdom. But, having given credit for those reforms, it's also true that oil revenues still remain a dominant force in the Saudi economy. And I think that's not a surprise given how dependent on oil Saudi was. So I think that means, we're really going to need to be looking at what reforms is the Saudi government continuing to push ahead with this year and into the medium term? And again, there, I think, there's been positive steps even in the last few days with the announcement of allowing foreign investment into the, or easing the restrictions on foreign investment into the equity market, into the property market. We've seen, I guess, over a number of weeks, signs that restrictions on alcohol are beginning to be eased. I think, which again, for people coming from the West is probably one thing that not only makes it easier for people to go and live and work in Saudi, but also for tourism if that continues. Um, I think another really important thing in the coming weeks or months is to look at the PIF, the Public Investment Fund. So they are going to be coming out, we understand, with their new 5-year strategy. How is that going to be adapted both to the development of AI that Saudi's trying to get into? How will it be developed, with a maybe a lower oil price investment? What's going to happen with NEOM? I think these are issues that investors and analysts are really interested in. So I think this broad issue around Vision 2030 reforms and diversification is going to continue to be a critical economic issue for Saudi.
Great. And as we get closer to the anniversary date, I think we'll be covering it more in depth here and kind of looking back over the past 10 years on Vision 2030. But let me bring in a quick question from Justin Alexander before we move on, asking about especially giga projects and what are you expecting in terms of giga project recalibration from PIF's 5-year strategy?
Well, I mean, I think the indications are that NEOM and the line, right, are being scaled back. There's been effectively announcement of of a review of this. The finance minister, I think, has said we have no egos. If something's not needed or is not working, we'll cut it back. But I think what's going to be key here is really being clear and transparent. I mean, I think, to be honest, there's been a lot of noise around NEOM and the line that things are changing, things have been cutting back, but it's really been quite hard to get any firm information on that. And I think, from my perspective, if we're looking at a situation where Saudi wants private sector investment, both from foreigners and from domestic investors, really transparency about where these projects are heading to convince people that they're, one, from an economic side, good for business, and secondly, that they are financeable in the current environment is going to be critical to this. So, we'll see what comes out and how specific the PIF are in their renewed strategies about what the direction of these projects is. But I guess I would say the one thing I will be looking for is whether there's more transparency and clarity about the intentions here.
Great, thank you. And Ellie, if I can shift to you, another year, another round of mass protests in Iran. Obviously, top of mind for a lot of people is questions around regime stability, and I'm sure you've been looking at that question really closely.
Yes, thank you so much for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis with you. The Islamic Republic truly is a declining power, but a declining power does not mean less danger. On the contrary, I actually believe that declining powers can be even more dangerous than the powers on the rise. The decline is both international and domestic. Internationally, Iran's ability to project power has been limited and curtailed, particularly since the Israeli electronic devices attack against Hezbollah. But also in other fields, we are seeing Iran having difficulties with its proxy forces, to the extent and degree that Ayatollah Khamenei himself said that now Iran is alone and Iran needs to act on its own in order to protect itself. But those measures were not enough to protect Iran from Israeli attack, and the Islamic Republic is now expecting a new round of Israeli attacks, and it has no effective deterrence. On the domestic side, the Islamic Republic is losing legitimacy because it cannot deliver economically to the people, and it has all the usual political issues, but of course the collapse of the rial against the dollar and the limited purchasing power of the Iranian public. And this time around, we are seeing mainly economic protests, but as in previous rounds of protests, economic protests develop into also having a political dimension. The only part that the Islamic Republic has done well in this regard is that it has managed to isolate women and teenage girls from the demonstrations and protests because it has simply stopped enforcing the hijab legislation. So in other words, now we have the middle class, which has been impoverished. We have the unprivileged classes of Iranians who are protesting, but also some wealthy merchants in the bazaar who are complaining against unpredictability of the market. They simply have stopped selling gold because if they get paper money, that value goes down so fast that they have no interest in selling gold in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran. In the short term, the Islamic Republic has no really good solutions or options to address these crises, both internationally and domestically. But there are two extreme options which may emerge. One extreme option is that Iran and the Islamic Republic acts in a way very similar to the Venezuelan army and political elites of Venezuela, meaning that the Venezuelans sacrificed one gentleman and his wife, meaning President Maduro and the first lady of that country, and perhaps reached an agreement with the United States. U.S. oil companies will be coming back to Venezuela. The press conference of President Trump demonstrated that he's not particularly interested in transfer of power to the opposition, including to the lady who is the Venezuelan winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. There is a change of leadership, but not necessarily a regime change. Now, this is a very promising prospect for the Islamic Republic. The leadership of the Islamic Republic may not be ready or willing to deliver Ayatollah Ali Khamenei to U.S. custody, but who would be surprised if 86-year-old Ayatollah Khamenei suddenly passes away tomorrow? After which the regime leadership says Ayatollah Khamenei was the sole obstacle to improvement of relations between the Islamic Republic and the United States of America. After that, the path is open to many things. That is an interesting way out or a potential way out for the Islamic Republic. The other one entails much bigger risks, and that is Iran choosing the nuclear option, fundamentally becoming the nuclear, the equivalent of North Korea in the Middle East region. The risks involved in that project, obviously, is that if that is detected by the Israeli intelligence or US intelligence, it will be stopped and it will entail cost for the regime. But nevertheless, if there is 50% chance of Iran transforming 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium to some degree, 90% enriched uranium for bomb making, and manages to produce 2 bombs, one for testing purposes and one for deterrence, that too would be a way out for the Islamic Republic. Both models entail great risks for Iran, for the regime, and also for the Middle East region, which may actually be targeted by the Islamic Republic anger, as it has done before against the oil shipments and oil installations in the Middle East region. And it remains to be seen which option the regime is willing to take, and if the regime manages, for example, to persuade President Trump to listen to a post-Ayatollah Khamenei regime in Iran rather than to the Israeli leadership.
Okay. Hussein, did you have a...
Yeah, I just wanted to add something, which is that there is a Gulf angle to the likely negotiations that undoubtedly took place between insiders in the Venezuelan regime, people associated with Ms. Rodriguez in particular, and the Trump administration, and one of the few countries had very good relations with the Bolivarian revolutionaries in Caracas and with the MAGA Trump movement in the United States is Qatar. And we may come to learn that Qatar was an important intermediary to any agreement that I would guess almost certainly exists between the White House and elements of the auto golpe new government in Venezuela. I just want to throw that out there because there's a very strong Gulf angle to that.
Yeah, thank you. Let me move on to Abbas, who's been very patiently waiting. So thank you, Abbas, on your first program with us officially as a member of AGSI. We should not have made you wait this long. As my apologies. But I know as you set up this excellent program here, we're excited to see what you have coming up, and there's a lot on your mind. But I know a lot of people, especially at the end of last year, were watching the parliamentary election in Iraq, and now watching the government formation. What is in your mind? What are the prospects for the formation of a new government? What's the timeline? Who is emerging as kind of the likely candidate for the next prime minister? And then we'll go into other issues after that.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you, and certainly I'm very excited to the working on Iraq within this framework of the Arab Gulf States Institute. To your question, of course, Iraq had its election like usual in a good standard on the 11th of November, and we had there was an emphasis this time among several political entities in Iraq to make sure that constitutional timelines are to be followed this time, and normally Iraq's government formation is a protracted process. And because of the nature of the balance of powers and the parliamentary system that Iraq follows, Iraq is not unique in that. I think the record of government formation is still held by Belgium. So normally it's not a Middle Eastern phenomenon. But Iraq, Lebanon, Belgium, other countries like that who follow this system normally take a lot of negotiation and a lot of consensus and consultations to reach a final formation of government. In Iraq, it's 3 layers. One of them is first, after the results are certified, is to have the parliament seated, and then there is an election of a parliament speaker and two deputies. Because of not the constitutional written rule, but it is a traditional of the constitutional system of Iraq, the top positions are allocated among the major groups in Iraq, factional groups, namely the Shia, the Kurds, and the Sunni Arabs. And also there are positions reserved for other pluralities in Iraq. So in order to make sure that these positions are allocated in a way that would satisfy their respective factional groups, there needs to be a lot of assurances and guarantees that everybody will follow on their promises, because once you appoint one person, you cannot guarantee that the others will fall in line on the following appointments. So successfully, the Iraqis have appointed a Speaker of Parliament and the two deputies, and they came down to the last day of the deadline for that process. Normally, the way it works is that in the first session, the speaker and his deputies will be elected. Then they would have 30 days to elect a president. The president would have 15 days to appoint or designate a prime minister candidate, and that prime minister candidate will have 30 days to form a cabinet and write a governance program and have it approved by the parliament. If it is not approved on the 30-day deadline, then another candidate for prime minister will be appointed, and that's how it will run. So if you look at the timeline and the constitution, the only place to buy time is the appointment of president, because there is no constitutional deadline on when a president is elected. All of these processes have to go in the parliament. Last term, we had an entire year to have a president appointed, and then the election was in October, and the government was seated in the following October. So a whole year to finish the formation of the government, and most of that was held by the appointment of a president. This time, there is a hope that the 30-day deadline will be respected, and then a president will be appointed. The one thing that is, or two things really, that hold the appointment of a president is, first, the presidency is reserved for the Kurds. And basically, there is a deep division between the two main Kurdish factions, political factions, between Erbil and Suleymaniye. And both of them would like to have that. And not only the negotiation between these two parties on the federal position of the presidency, but now it is being tied also to the allocation of positions and balance of powers in the Kurdistan regional government that still has not been seated since their election over a year ago. That is where we are. Once a president is elected, the Shia will need, before the appointment of a president, to have agreed on a prime minister and to get an assurance from the president that he will appoint that candidate from the larger parliamentary bloc. There has been a record where this promise has not been followed. That's why the assurances this time need to be stronger. It is basically really a negotiation. If we are following the deadlines set by the Constitution, we are looking at a government formation to be finalized by mid-March. If it is not, then it could take a little longer, or if there is no agreement among the groups and also within each group, then we could look at a more protracted process, which could, as last time, last for over a year.
Right. Well, we'll continue watching that. But in the meantime, I wanted to bring the Gulf into the conversation. And how do you see Gulf Iraq relations evolving over the coming year?
Well, Iraq-Gulf relations are extremely important regionally and also internationally. The Iraq for post-2003, there was at least a decade of lack of Iraq-Gulf relations in the way that Iraqis and the Gulf governments and also the international community would hope they would be. But since probably 2015, there was a shift. First, the Gulf opened up to relations with Iraq, and that was an effort led by Saudi Arabia. When Saudi moved towards positively towards Iraq, then the relations began to move on multilateral levels. But also Iraqi political class decided to move towards what we may call it balanced relations for Iraqi relations in the region. In the old times, there was more of a lopsided relation in favor of Iran. Post 2015, 2016, we had an opening towards the Gulf. We have seen better diplomatic relations, embassies appointed on both sides, but also we have seen more movement or positive movement towards economic cooperation, cultural cooperation, and others. But those until today, unfortunately, remain transactional and episodic, not something that is sustained, not something that is following strategic guidelines. That is still to be implemented. And this is one of the things that we will focus on and we'll try to generate ideas about here at the Institute. But it is the good news is that the trajectory is moving in the right direction. Relations are improving. Also, there is another issue here with Iraq Gulf relations is basically there are more of bilateral relations that take different patterns. Iraq, Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait, Iraq, Oman, Iraq, Saudi relations, Iraq, Bahrain relations, Iraq, UAE relations. They are kind of really, each one of them is taking a different shape. We don't see a unified way. The comparison might be a little bit questionable, but if you think about Iraqi relations with the European Union and with the members of the European Union, there is more of a harmony in the direction of these relations. But between Iraq and the Gulf states, there is more of or less clarity, let's put it that way, in a positive term. But I think it is much better than where it was, and there is the potential for it to go even to a better level is there, and it is the more likely thing to happen. Iraq has adopted what they call positive neutrality. They don't take part in the disputes and disagreements internationally and regionally, so that is helpful. Any kind of disputes within the Gulf, the GCC, Iraq tries to maintain same distance to all disputants, and once in a while they even try to offer help in mediation or in being positive interlocutor with all sides. But in general, I think the one thing that the takeaway from that is really the both sides, Iraq and the Gulf, would do very well if they can reinstate the integration of Iraq into its Gulf neighborhood in the same way it was in the 1970s or even early 80s. I think there was a lot of multidimensional, if you will, cooperation, political, cultural, security, economic, education. Iraqis have been a positive element in all of these sectors in the Gulf as they were forming their newly founded states. I think the potential is there. Iraq has great stability now. Iraq has a lot to offer. And also the Gulf can offer a lot to Iraq. And it is only natural that the relations will go in a better direction.
Great, thank you, Abbas. And it's hard to have the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq in this webinar and not turn to him now, just to bring him into this part of the conversation, at least, Doug, and have your maybe perspective on U.S.-Iraq relations, which Abbas mentioned but did not go in depth in this part.
What I'm trying to figure out is the direction that the Trump administration wants to go in. It was pretty clear in the first Trump administration that he saw relations with Iraq almost exclusively as a subset of U.S. policy toward Iran. And I think that there is a bit more of an effort now to separate Iraq from Iran in terms of policy, not necessarily in terms of flow of dollars or economic development. It is interesting that he has appointed a specific envoy, Mark Savaya, as an envoy to Iraq. While most of what he does has been supportive of some of the minority communities in Iraq or trying to find ways to draw Iraq away from Iranian influence, I think that there is a lot of opportunity there. And I think that the policy that the Trump administration is following has a lot of support among the Iraqi American community and different parts of the Iraqi American community. So there are opportunities to the extent that the Trump administration wants to try to identify them and potentially exploit them, but there are also difficulties. There is still the very deep concern of Iranian security meddling in the region, and the very deep concern that any American dollars that flow into Iraq could get into Iran and help Iran finance what this administration hopes will be a failing economy that can change Iranian policy. So I still think that the Iran-Iraq relationship will be the biggest element of U.S. policy toward Iraq. But maybe with a specific envoy, there will be a little bit more nuance in what happens in the coming year.
Well, that fear of helping to fund Iranian meddling in Iraq by supporting Iraqi institutions, is also a Gulf concern, right? It's not just an American concern, and it's not just about Iraq. It's exactly the concern about Lebanon.
Abbas, you have your hand raised. I'll give you 2 minutes.
2 minutes are more than what I was hoping for. Thank you. I was going to add something, and when it comes to the U.S.-Iraq relations, I was specifically being faithful to your questions. But certainly, the one aspect of it is that the Iraq Gulf relations have been at the heart of U.S.-Iraqi relations. Iraq opening to the Gulf and the Gulf opening to Iraq has been an international demand and a U.S. demand to make sure that or within what is considered to be U.S. national interest to have in the region, to have that relation warm up and also go to levels where they are now and hopefully even more as they will be going in the future. Also, I wanted to emphasize that since we are having a new government, Iraq had not had a history of a good continuity from one administration to another. So a new government tends normally to do away with all of the previous work of the work of the previous government and then start afresh. And since we are in the midst of a government formation, I think a lot remains to be seen on what the coming administration will look at. That there are constants so far, including the opening to the Gulf. I don't think that it will be reversed, but also the nature of the new government, who will form it, what kind of internal relations the coming prime minister will have, will tell us how the relations with the Gulf and the relations with the United States are going to move forward. And that is very important. So a lot to be seen and a lot to be said once we see a government seated, hopefully in the spring of this year.
Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you very much. We have a lot of really good questions that have been submitted, but I do want to go back to Kristin for just one follow-up, because Kristin, among the large portfolio that you cover one of my favorite topics, which is internal dynamics and issues of kind of a renegotiation of the social contract in the Gulf, issues of citizenship. What are kind of the trends that you're seeing over the past year and going into this year around these topics?
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. Because this is a topic that I definitely want to be looking at more closely and make a priority for this coming year. Um, Basically, as we look at the Gulf states, going through these big transitions that I mentioned earlier, both, fundamental economic transitions and their orientation in the world. This, of course, affects the way that they view their own citizens and the way that they're attempting to bring others into their country, which is, of course, a huge interest. We see this globally about wanting to attract the top talent to your country as a big part of the economic diversification process. So I think we see these two dynamics that we see globally, both this desire to, again, remain relevant by opening up to top talent and to bring investments and to bring tourists to and investors into your country and actual talent. That's one thing that's going on in these states that we can look at, and we've seen a lot of shifts in the way that they're trying to make that easier. And of course, these are countries that have always brought in, huge number of foreign workers, no question. But to start to empower them in ways and to give them ways for them to get long-term residency and even citizenship is a big dynamic that we see happening, especially in the UAE and to some extent also in Saudi Arabia and some of the other states. On the other hand, you've got the other dynamic too that we see globally, which is that idea of kind of an America First type issue, a kind of more populist backlash against foreigners or migrants, but also an elevation, like we see, kind of like we have a lot of white nationalism in the United States. We've seen these kind of dynamics as well in the states, in the Gulf states, most notably in Kuwait, which is going through a real period of kind of questioning who's a real Kuwaiti and basically rehashing that through withdrawing citizenship from people in that country. So I think there's a lot of dynamics that are linked to the global dynamics of citizenship that are happening in the Gulf states that are extremely important in terms of how people are living within the Gulf states today. It's really impacting tens of thousands of citizens. So I'm hoping to take that up as a big project for the following year.
Thank you. Let me turn to questions now, and we have a good question from Helen Lechner that I will just address it to the group, but I know these are issues that many of you, including especially Hussein, Bill, Doug, and others, have been looking at closely. She asks, how do you expect the increasing rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE to develop during the year? Looking at international, but also mutual investments, political competition in the Horn of Africa, the emergence of the Israeli Somaliland recognition, relations with the US, and so on. So I'll open it up for whoever wants to kick it off.
Raymond, let me start and just say the basic problem here, I think, is the difference in the self-view and the worldview of the governments in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi. There is a weight of size and tradition that gives Saudi Arabia the sense that it is the predominant power, the most influential country, the largest economy. And I think that this makes it more difficult for Saudi Arabia to change its policies and its society as quickly as some might like. There is also a weight of tradition that will try to keep Saudi Arabia as the focus of the Arab and the Muslim world. So I think there are social and political factors on Saudi Arabia that will want it to keep a strong role in the region and internationally. When you look at the Emirates, they have far fewer ties to traditions. They are culturally and legally a younger country. They have had a strong leadership, and they are smaller but economically well endowed in land and in talent, and have been able to move much more quickly. So I think you see the probably quite normal differences of opinion and tensions between an established power that has a history and a weight that goes back centuries, and a new country that is dynamic and has been able to bring in the kind of talent that Kristin was talking about in a much bigger way than other countries. I think what both countries will need to work toward is a modus vivendi, an understanding that permits them to work on their own domestic issues the way they wish, but also does not prevent them from cooperating on regional threats or where GCC action is necessary. And I think that may be what the challenge is. I'll let others comment on this, but I think that there's a fundamental sort of mismatch in the visions, but that doesn't mean that the tension is going to get significantly worse.
So that's all correct. The only thing I would add is, or 2 points. One is that you're right. UAE, because it does not have the regional Arab leadership role or the global Islamic leadership role that Saudi Arabia has and wants to retain, it has much fewer commitments, and it feels less constrained, so it can move fast and break things, right? And the early Silicon Valley kind of notion of, if they get an idea and they're convinced it's a good idea in their own interest, they'll just do it. And that Saudi Arabia cannot really behave that way, which is why we've seen time and again the UAE take an initiative, followed next year or a year later, a year after that, by Saudi Arabia and others. The other thing is that they don't need to find a modus vivendi. They have a modus vivendi. What they need to do is prevent the modus vivendi from breaking down. Right? Competition is a natural condition for UAE and Saudi Arabia to be in, as long as it's competition and constructive rivalry over economic development, investment, commerce, trade, and even to some extent jockeying for position diplomatically. I think that, that should be totally fine. That's totally manageable. What is alarming to people, or potentially alarming to people, is the possibility of a breakdown in that modus vivendi, is the possibility of Saudi Arabia and the UAE starting to see each other as not as sort of rivals, but as competitors in a much more kind of aggressive way. And I think you can just look at the way in which the Gulf countries reacted to the Israeli attack on Qatar, and the attempt to kill the Hamas negotiators in Doha. Which was unanimous, vociferous, and they didn't really even need to coordinate their position. The position came together instinctively and naturally because it was a shared threat. And even though it was perceived, I think, in different ways in different countries, there was an immediate rallying around of Qatar, because each one of them could imagine themselves being in that situation with some other power, for one reason or another. And I think what that unified response showed is that there's still an essential nature to the GCC and to the pattern of cooperation and unity, a fundamental bedrock of unity of long-term goals, of needs, of interests, right? Fundamental interests that the Gulf countries all share. And that sort of pushes back against the idea, I think, that there can be a profound rift.
Thank you. Bill, please, yes. Yeah.
Just a word about maybe considering the specific areas where there's some conflict and competition quickly. In Syria, it's mostly, and it seems like there are some ideological differences, but they seem, I think, manageable. I don't see that as a particular site for big issues. In Yemen, it's more, each side has projected power. There's calculations of interests, but there too, I think really it's a manageable situation. The Emiratis seem to be willing to cede. It's near the end of that conflict in some ways, or their involvement in it. The real difficult issue, oddly enough, in terms of a geographic conflict, is Sudan, and more broadly the Horn of Africa. There's a real disagreement or a difference of view about who has or who should have primacy there. The Saudis see it as a backyard national security issue. The Emirates see it as a area of projection of influence and of their acutely perceived national interest, whether it's food security or mineral resources, things like that. So that's an area where there really needs to be a diplomatic intervention and a solution, because it does hold the possibility of creating some more conflict between them.
It is the big fault line. I agree with that, because on top of everything else, you have a presumed ideological component.
Abbas, I see your hand, but I want to go to Tim, if it's okay with you, just to address. There was a part of the question that specifically asked about mutual investments or investments in general. So, Tim, in addition to your raised hand, perhaps you can address that part.
Yeah. I was going to comment further on the sort of, I guess, economic competition rivalry. And I think, there's an element here where, competition between Saudi, UAE, and indeed more, broadly in the Gulf is good, in the sense I think it's forcing all of the countries to look at reforms that should be good to attracting investment, talent into the region. But I think there's also elements of risk here where you're really relying on being able to capture for the countries involved a larger share of the global market by these reforms. If you can't do that, then the risk of competition sort of eroding, or that you're investing in areas that ultimately are not going to bear fruit, I think increase. And I think we've seen areas right within OPEC and OPEC Plus where there've clearly been issues between Saudi and the UAE. Saudi's regional headquarters policy, which is clearly large extent targeting moving companies from UAE into Riyadh or areas maybe where that's happened. But I think the whole push by Saudi into sort of a more forceful policy in terms of travel, airlines, logistics, technology and AI may be another emerging one where both countries are steaming full ahead here, presuming there's enough of an increase in market size that both will thrive. But whether that's true, we will, I guess, find out in the coming years. So I think, competition is good, but, there are also risks, I think, that could raise between the two of them in particular.
Thank you. Abbas?
Well, thank you. And glad you brought him in before me, because he set the stage on this equation of risk versus benefit from this competition. And I think from an Iraqi perspective, I wanted just to highlight a couple of issues. Iraq, while it is now enjoying a lot of stability, a lot of security, but it is very fragile, and Iraq is not very immune when it comes to regional rivalries. And one thing that the Iraqis always take pride in is that their work in mediation, when they solved the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they were part of the mediation up to the announcement. Even when it was announced in China, the Iraqis didn't have a problem with this. They say, let it be announced anywhere. It is our work. We don't want the credit. We will reap the benefits from the stability and the harmony between the two countries. But one of the things that Iraq has invested a lot in and put a lot of hubs in is what they call it the development route, which is a trade that would link the East with Europe and the West ultimately. And Iraq will be hoped to be the linking between the Gulf and Europe. And so far, it has signatories like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Turkey. They were hoping to solve their issues with Kuwait, so it will be more smooth, and there is no rivalry between the Mubarak port and the Al Faw port. And they were hoping to get Saudi also as part of it. And when there is a departure in harmony between, or there is a kind of rivalries, aggressive rivalries, as Hussein put it, between the Gulf members, that affects the Iraqi efforts to enjoy the stability required, the regional stability required to help Iraq with this project, because it has been the standard bearer of the project. And they were Sudanese government, for example, they considered it as the main or the cornerstone of their economic and foreign policy. So we hope that these rivalries work on the benefit side and the good side that Tim was talking about, because the risks can go beyond the involved parties.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to move on to another question, but I see Doug's raised hand. So Doug, please go ahead.
I just wanted to jump onto one comment that Abbas made. There are a couple of long-term projects, logistical projects, that seek to link South Asia through the Middle East to Europe or something along those lines. Then the development road going through Iraq and Turkey is one of them. There's also the IMEC proposals that would predominantly go through Saudi Arabia and then the Levant. I think that these are areas of great opportunity in the future. It is possible that both of these routes could potentially be profitable down the road. And I think in the short term, there are opportunities for American, European, Middle Eastern, and South Asian companies in constructing logistics nodes and the different pieces of transportation networks. But they could also create greater friction, economic competition and friction as one becomes developed more quickly. So again, it's something that we should be looking in the next year, but also 5 and 10 years in the future, because these are both long-term projects. But Abbas is exactly right. The Iraqis have tried to put together with Turkey a good program and now want to link it to the Gulf in the most effective way.
Great, thank you. Damien Jones noticed that China and Russia have not come up in this conversation yet. So he asks, from an extra-regional perspective, what do the panelists anticipate from China and Russia this year in the Gulf and broader Middle East in pursuit of their respective geopolitical interests? Pose it to anyone in the group.
Well, I mean, Russia has its hands full in Ukraine, honestly. It's not looking to do much in the Gulf region, I think. And I think China is as steady as she goes in the Gulf. It is getting what it needs. It's true that the U.S. domination of the 3 great maritime choke points is a theoretical problem, strategic problem for China. But in fact, the U.S., with its huge naval presence, is ensuring the free flow of energy to China and manufactured goods out of China to Europe and North America. So it's very helpful to them. And I think they have what they need right now. So it's as steady as she goes for China, in my view. I don't see either of them getting involved in a major way, and that's why we haven't brought it up much.
And also, I think there is, if you look at China is moving more into integration with the region. China's approach is always economic, and one thing, for example, if you follow recent developments, Chinese universities began to implement Arabic education programs in many universities, and they gave opportunities to Arabs to go teach there. I know many friends in Iraq, and interestingly, after so many years of Iraqi higher education, just a couple of weeks ago, Iraq announced that they are having Chinese studies in an Iraqi university, and with the presence of the Chinese diplomatic delegation, and it's a lot of this has an economic focus. I remember post 2001. After 9/11, we had a big interest in the United States to teach Arabic in many universities, but it was security related, military related, political related. But the Chinese are approaching it from a different way, the economy. And I think this is one of the reasons why China is a tough competitor to the United States in the region and worldwide. I think we need to look at it also and understand how the Western world, and particularly the United States, would modify its approach to the Middle East along those lines, because I think they are better in the future and in the nature of where the relations need to go between the United States and the region.
Thank you. Let me move on to Doug and Tim on this question before addressing another one from the chat. Please, Doug.
Yes, 1 point each on China and Russia. On China, the United States has essentially won the war for AI investment over China, but it's going to have to keep progress going forward. And the Chinese will continue to provide things that the United States and the West will not provide to the Gulf, whether it be some technical cooperation on ballistic missiles like in Saudi Arabia or in lower cost communication systems. And this could create some problems in U.S. relations, but I think the focus on AI and building tech stacks is going to help the United States for a long time to come. On Russia, the big issue is really OPEC Plus, particularly if you have, as I think Justin Alexander mentioned in his question, President Trump focusing on $50 per barrel oil. The relationship, particularly with Saudi Arabia and Russia, to have complementary oil market policies to keep their market share and to keep prices high enough that they can afford what the Saudis, what the Emiratis, and other countries want to do with the oil income will be the biggest issue going forward, and the way where Russia could play a more specific positive or negative role with the Gulf.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the points I was going to make is what Doug's just made. I think if oil drops from low 60s to low 50s, what is OPEC Plus going to do? And would they be able to come to an agreement where they cut production again to support oil? And my sense is that that may be quite difficult to do in the current circumstance. I think, the other thing, China on the other side of the oil market, I think, clearly a lot of Venezuelan oil was ending up in China. Toughening of the, enforcement of sanctions on Iran, Russia, if those sorts of things happen, there may be some realignment in terms of where oil supply and demand are coming from for various producers. That could have an impact on the demand for Gulf oil. I think on the China side, one other thing is clearly Chinese investment into the region, but also, maybe something that's not been focused on is the ability of Saudi and other Gulf borrowers to actually sell bonds to Chinese and other Asian investors. I think something they're looking at, trying to market more into the Asia region, and also bank loans, where apparently quite a more sizable share of the syndicated loan came from China by media reports and maybe has been in the past. So it may not be big changes, but I think, in various ways, China and Russia are clearly going to be directly or indirectly still important players on the economic side in the region.
Great, thank you. John Twitchell has a question about Egypt and the role that Egypt will play in U.S.-Middle East relations in 2026. What are Egypt's security priorities, and what do relations between Sisi and Trump, where do relations stand between Sisi and Trump? But also left panelists to address, if possible, the role that Egypt is expected to play in the region in 2026. So I open it up to whoever wants to take that.
Well, let me start, and maybe I can spark some more comments. It is clear that the Gulf cares about the stability of Egypt and wants to see Egypt on a more positive economic and political trajectory. And both Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have invested heavily in Egypt in the past year in an attempt to help stabilize and build the Egyptian economy in a way that doesn't require simply either depositing money in the central bank or giving them large grants. So I think that there is the real question for me is, will the evolved Saudi and Emirati and probably other Gulf approaches to stabilizing and developing Egypt be successful and continue, or will they continue to try other things? And then if anybody else wants to, maybe Bill wants to talk a little bit about Egypt's role in the Horn of Africa in cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the Quad and how that might work, could be another issue.
before we get to the Horn, let me just say that one of the Western attitudes towards the Arab world in the past few years has been the idea that, widespread idea, that if Saudi Arabia wants to assert itself as the regional leader of the Arab world, it must take on primary responsibility for repairing over the long run the Egyptian economy and the inability of the Egyptian economy to provide sufficient jobs for the workforce, potential workforce. And I think that remains an expectation that Saudi Arabia can't meet because no one can meet it. It's a kind of an impossible goal. Anyway, I'll stop with that.
Just two quick points. On relations between the United States and Egypt, I would just say that for all the reasons that we talked about, that President Trump has good relations and strong, warm relations with the Gulf. I don't think that those connections are there between Washington, between Trump in particular, and Sisi, and he views Egypt probably quite differently than he does the Gulf as a useful partner. On Gulf-Egypt relations, I agree with what other people have said. I think it's an important, very important relationship, particularly on Sudan and the Horn, as Hussein mentioned. Saudi Arabia sees, I think, eye to eye with Egypt on these issues. It'll be interesting to see how relations with the Emirates and Egypt develop in the coming year, if there are continued tensions, particularly on the issue of Sudan.
Great, thank you. We're running up against our allotted time here, so what I'd love to do is just give a couple of minutes of concluding remarks from everybody, if that sounds good to all of you. And I think we'll do it kind of in the same order that we started with. We'll start with Doug, Bill, Hussein, Kristin, Tim, Ali, and Abbas. So Doug, please. And Ali, in the process, if I can impose on you to address the question about the water crisis in Iran and kind of how critical it is. But we'll start with Doug, please.
I wanted to quickly address the questions about human rights. And as somebody who has lived in and covered human rights extensively for the US government for much of the past 35 years, the way I view human rights developments in the Gulf is essentially a glass half full. The Gulf does not yet meet the standards that the United States has traditionally imposed for human rights. But if you look at the rights of workers in most of the Gulf, if you look at the rights of women, if you look at the rights of expatriates, there have been massive and very quick changes, mostly for the better, with a couple of exceptions, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and in other parts of the region. I think what's important when talking about human rights in the Gulf is that people be specific. The one area where there has been not very much progress across the board has been in freedom of expression. And I think that is one where it is likely that the Trump administration is not going to focus on. So again, for activists who want to see the ability of Gulf citizens to freely and openly criticize their government, I don't expect that there will be much development, and I don't think that there's going to be much international pressure in the current environment to move in that direction. But I want to make sure that people understand there has already been significant improvement in many of the Gulf countries in areas that I was concerned about a decade ago or 2 decades ago, where we thought there might never be progress for women, for expatriates, or in labor markets.
Bill,
should I go ahead? Oh,
Yeah.
yes, Bill. Okay.
Just a word or two. I'll be following developments in Syria, also in the Horn, in Sudan, looking at some of these broader issues of competition inside the Gulf, but also ways that the Gulf projects power and influence. It'll be interesting to see how the Gulf states in these conflicts and states that I've talked about on the periphery collaborate with U.S. policy or find ways to work with the United States or try to influence U.S. policy on these issues. And also how internal developments, particularly in Syria, for example, will have an impact on how much influence the Gulf countries can bring to bear, how much impact, for example, instability or insecurity in Syria could have on levels of Gulf investment or efforts of the Gulf states to continue to have political and economic influence in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you. Kristin, can we? Oh, sorry, Hussein, and then.
No, it's up to you. I mean,
no. Go ahead, Hussein. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I was going to say is that what we're, I think, still working to discover, and in the case of policymakers, construct is a stable post October 7 reality in the region. Right? The October 7 attack unleashed a series of conflicts that were contained but interrelated, right? In Gaza, in Lebanon, to some extent, the northern West Bank, the 12-day war in between Israel and Iran, closing with an American strike on the Iranians, and above all, the downfall of Assad in Syria. Now, what's fascinating is that series of discrete but interconnected conflicts did not fundamentally undo the pre-existing drift towards the use of diplomacy and investment and soft and sticky power as opposed to hard power by most of the countries seeking to project influence in the region. You could argue that Israel has emerged as one such country and that changes things. But, and I did discuss that earlier, but I think for the most part, the Arab countries and Turkey have pulled back from confrontation and conflict. Iran has found its wings clipped, and the new role of Israel is still being determined by Israel, by the United States, and will be greatly affected by the outcome of the Israeli election sometime this coming year. So essentially what we're working together to try to figure out and shape is what sort of Middle East are we going to have, especially in terms of security and stability, which is what all the Gulf countries in their own way seek in order to pursue the economic transformations that they're the focus of their national agendas at the moment. To what extent can it be maintained? The big game changer is the downfall of the Syrian regime. And we'll have to see what happens as a consequence of that. But it can and should be overwhelmingly a net positive to the region.
Thank you, Hussein. Kristin?
I'll take up a couple of things that were listed in questions. I did want to say something about Yemen, just because I've been following that really closely and the consequence of the disputes that have opened up between Saudi Arabia and UAE and Yemen. I mean, you could say that their interests were separate from the beginning, and even though they unified in entering into Yemen. In fact, Fatma al-Asrar and I wrote a piece way back, I think it was like 2016 or something, saying that their interests were essentially different and that this was going to be problematic. But I think what we've seen in the more recent conflict with the Southern Transitional Council, making sort of a power move into Hadramaut and Al-Mahra and now being pushed back. What's striking to me is the public feud that's opened up. I mean, we've seen conflicts and tensions and different interests between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but they're now directly calling them out publicly and formally. We've seen that by Saudi Arabia doing that and even like bombing UAE interests now with the head of the Southern Transitional Council, Adros Zubaydi. They've called him basically a traitor and now publicly called out the UAE for facilitating his escape, supposedly. That's the Unified Forces have been saying that. So I think this is a worrying development for those who want to see more cooperation amongst these states and how they're going to manage those disputes. And for me, I look at basically these larger forces of regionalization, where we've seen the Gulf states have to kind of turn to other bigger partners and adjusting their kind of strategy in this shifting global order. And with the UAE kind of leaning a bit more towards Israel through the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia opening up a bit more, perhaps closer ties to Turkey. I think a lot of people are wondering if that's going to form more kind of strict interest blocks that could then seep into all of these different interest areas, whether in the Horn of Africa or in Yemen. We've kind of seen that with the Southern Transitional Council calling upon their stance towards Israel as a way of kind of signaling their posture. So I think if it hardens into something like that, it's going to be much more difficult for the Gulf states to do what they did previously, which is what Hussein spoke about, where they really were able to come together in their common interests. So that's something I'm going to be watching. Just one short thing on human rights. I think probably, unfortunately for the region, they're kind of facing the same trends that we see globally as well, which is much more centralization of power, like we see in the United States. That means less power going to elected decision-making bodies. We've seen even in the United States, the Congress being paralyzed and deferring much more power. And I think we see the same dynamics even in the states that did have some representative bodies in the Gulf. Again, kind of more the power going to central powers. But there are some kind of windows for maybe in different ways appealing for some attention to human rights. I noticed that when President Trump met with the Saudis, they did manage to get the release of a Saad al-Ahmadi, who was a joint Saudi-US citizen. So again, kind of pulling on the US national interest in a way to like get this person who had been held for what he has been speaking about, kind of freedom of expression issues, and not allowed to travel. There are really hundreds of people that are more, perhaps even in Saudi Arabia, that are not allowed to travel, was released. So maybe under these new kind of frameworks, there's some way to address these issues, at least in a minimal way.
Great, thank you. Tim, over to you.
So I guess maybe a couple of points. I mean, I think where I come from, right, the pot of money for Saudi Arabia is going to be much smaller in 2026 than it has been. Oil in 2022 was around $100 a barrel. Let's say it stays at $60 a barrel. That's a big adjustment in terms of what Saudi can do domestically and overseas. I think the good news is I think there is a stronger economic policy making and governance framework in place now than there was a decade ago. So they've demonstrated, I think, on the economic side, they can move quickly and decisively. That could well be tested this year, depending on what happens in the oil market. And then the last point is, it's going to be a good test to see how far the reforms have gone with this oil price environment. Can non-oil growth, can employment growth hold up? Or do we go back to, sort of the, long ago cycle of lower oil prices basically equals lower non-oil growth? We'll see, I think, as 2026 develops.
Great, thank you. Ali?
Let me end my little presentation by warning against being too much influenced by social media and what we are exposed to. If you look at the social media, the Islamic Republic is going to collapse yesterday, yet this has not materialized. Why? Because the Islamic Republic is a fairly competent regime, particularly when it comes to suppression of the domestic opposition. Yes, the regime is facing formidable challenges, including ecological challenges, as referred to by the questioner, about the scarcity of water and the water crisis that Tehran, for example, is facing. The regime is facing a political legitimacy problem, performance problems, economic issues. Yes, all of these problems are there. But the Islamic Republic has also some solutions. One of them being the one provided by the example and role model of Venezuela. If it is possible for the Venezuelan regime to change its leadership, but retain power and the regime remains intact, why should the Islamic Republic not try a similar way out of its current misery? Get rid of the sanctions regime, invite US oil companies to Iran, and satisfy the economic needs of the public and fundamentally survive. And the other solution, the less attractive solution, I suspect, is becoming the North Korea of the Middle East by dashing for a nuclear bomb, establishing effective deterrence against Israel, by suppressing the protesters, and over time be forgiven and get sanctions relief, just as neighboring Pakistan managed to do so over time. So I think it is too early to write the obituary of the Islamic Republic, but we may start working on the obituary of the leader of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Thank you, Ali. And Abbas, you get the final word.
Thank you. That's a big responsibility. So Ali gave us some warnings. I would like to end this by a couple of recommendations, maybe. When it comes to Iraq relations with its region and also with the international community. I think for the Gulf, I'm very pleased to see the relations take a similar, almost 180 turn towards positive engagement. And that's great because Iraq needs it, the Gulf needs it, and in fact, the world's interest need it. It's a very important place in the world's geography, and many interests intersect there, and stability helps everybody, and harmonious relations help everybody. But they need to strategize and institutionalize these relations, move away from, again, as what I said, the transactional and episodic relations to something sustained and something with a vision. And it needs to be a vision that is a departure from what reignited the relations, which is basically the Gulf tried to score points in their competition with Iran. So courting Iraq was a good way to start. I think Gulf relations with Iraq need to be about Gulf-Iraq relations, and then both sides can go forward in a positive way and on the right trajectory and get the potential of these relations realized. And that also extends to relations with from the United States and the international community. I think one thing has been lacking was the real inclination and real work towards strengthening the Iraqi institutions. Vulnerable Iraqi state institutions will always open the door for the reasons why there is a lot of complaint about what goes on in Iraq, whether it is weapons out of the control of the state, whether it is the lack of functionality within the state at the federal or local levels, corruption, all other things really are the genesis of all of that is the weak state institutions, security, political, and other institutions, economic institutions. So as much we invest and as much we help Iraq to build its institutions, strengthen the state immunities to all external exogenous manipulation, then everybody will have a better Iraq to work with. And finally, I think for the Iraqis need to look at those as not sense of entitlement to go and get help from the Gulf, from the neighbors, from the US and other international community key actors, but they need also to lead the initiative, tell people what they expect and they want, and work with people who are in place and in a position to help them out, rather than wait that somebody would knock at their door and give them ideas on how they get help. One last word, if we have a couple of seconds, on what Ali just mentioned, which is very important. You know, a lot of people think that solving the problems with the current Iranian, the Islamic Republic, will end by changing the form of the political system in Iran and replacing the Islamic Republic with something else. It might solve problems of some people, but other people need to be careful what they wish for. Let's remember that Iran is an extremely nationalist state. If we have another system that enjoys a lot of support from the West, a lot of support from the international community, a lot of support from the people of Iran, the expectations will be different. Turkey will be in trouble. The Gulf will be in trouble. Let's remember how Iran was before the Islamic Republic was in place, and how these countries in the neighborhood were feeling when Iran was there. And there is no comparison to now, because at that time, some of these countries were 10 years old and 20 years old as states. Now they have ambitions, they have position in the world, and they have a lot to lose. And an Iranian state that is so strong, fully potentially sort of realizing what it looks for, that would be another set of deals to work with. I mean, I wish Ali has time to comment on that, but this is
we'll do it in another session very soon. So we'll definitely schedule something to discuss that.
Be careful.
Absolutely.
I agree.
But on that note, I think we'll give our audience a break and all of you a break. So thank you all for being with us for this fascinating discussion. It's always such a great way to start our year. To our audience members, thank you for being with us, and we'll see you very soon in person and over multiple webinars throughout the year.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Thank you all very much, and have a wonderful day and wonderful year ahead.